Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Board with Each Other, the board gaming podcast that looks at games through the lens of playing them as a pair, whether that is as a couple or with a good friend or that dwarf that you live with that just keeps burrowing through into next door and creating tunnels between the houses. I'm Simpson and I'm joined as ever by my wife, my player 2 and my co-host, Hannah Kelly.
Hi guys.
So today we are taking on another big one. Another classic, because it is now 12 years old. Apparently, that's long enough to be called a classic. But it is a heavyweight of the board gaming hobby, and that is Terra Mystica, the most beige euro of beige euros. So in Terra Mystica, you take on the role of a fantasy race. And you've got all your usual fantasy tropes in there. So you've got halflings, you've got dwarves.
Mermaids.
Yes, mermaids. Which are very common in fantasy literature. Giants, etc., etc., and different variants of humans. And the role, the object of the game, basically, is to take over a map. So there's a map of a fantasy land, and you need to take over as much as possible of that with your structures. You can only build structures on a type of land that has affinity with your race. So, for example, dwarves like to build on sort of rubbly, stony ground. The giants like mountains. Witches like forests, etc., etc. And when you start the game, you will place a couple of what are called settlements, so your most basic structures down on any square on the map that matches with your faction. But from then on, you're going to need to terraform surrounding squares from whatever terrain they are into the terrain that you need in order to place more structures down. To do that costs a resource called spades. To obtain spades, you either need to use various powers that you unlock during the game, or you need to spend workers, which is another resource. The final resource is money, coins, which also count towards victory points at the end of the game. So, there's a push-pull mechanic around spending money for things and not having that money left. To build your structures, they also cost coins and workers. You get income at the start of your turn depending on how many structures and what structures you have built. So the more you build, the more income you get. But after the first tier, there are 3 tiers of structures. Those structures are replaced. So if you build a tier 2 structure, you have to replace a tier 1 structure with it. So again, the mechanism of the income that you get every turn differs depending on what's out on the board. You can only build adjacent to a space that already has one of your structures in it. And in the case of trading houses, which is a second tier structure, if you build adjacent to another player, you get discounts on the amount of money that they cost, which can be very, very powerful. Money is quite scarce, particularly in the early game. However, there's a flip side to that mechanic, that if you build in a space next to somebody, they get power at the sacrifice of victory points. Quite unusually in this game, you both start at 20 victory points, you don't start at 0.
The only way is down.
The only way is down. And to gain this power, which is yet another mechanic, which I'll explain in a second, you need to pay victory points. So, for example, and it depends what size of structures you have that they're placing their structures next to.
Complicated maths.
Yes, complicated maths. That all interacts with your power pots. So you have 3 pots on your player board. And on those, you move these little purple pips in between to show how much power you have. You use power to enact several very, very powerful changes during the game. So you could spend power, for instance, to gain workers on a turn. You could spend power to gain spades. You could spend it to gain money.
Build bridges.
Yeah, build bridges. So it's a very, very important resource. But it's got a mechanic where your power starts out split between pot 1 and pot 2. Pot 1 needs to be empty before you can put anything from pot 2 into pot 3. Only in pot 3 is the power usable, and then it loops back up into pot 1. So you need to be careful when you use it, because if you just burn it off straight away, you're then back in the situation where you're having to pull all the power. Whenever you gain power, it goes from 1 to 2, not 2 to 3. Hopefully that makes sense. Also, at the start of your turn, for each game, there's a random set of 5 bonus tiles that are dealt out, and these will usually affect something you can do during your turn, or it will affect what resources it will add to your income at the start. So, for instance, in player order, you choose your choice out of 5. And for instance, you'd have something that gets you an extra 6 money that turn, or something that you could use to gain a spade during that turn. Each of the bonus tiles that aren't chosen every turn start getting coins placed on them. So the longer they go unchosen, the more appealing they become. So it sort of balances them out. And like I say, those are random. In terms of victory conditions, there are several. The first is the player with the longest, the most connected structures, basically, wins and will win. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's something like 16 points. The person in second place gets half that, usually, or 2/3 of that. The second is the players who have reached the highest on the cult tracks. There's an extra board which represent 4 cults: air, fire, water, and land.
Wind.
That's air. Wind is air.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's embarrassing.
Well, yeah, definitely leave that in. And again, through mechanisms, either through paying power or by building religious structures, or just as a bonus, depending on your faction at the start of the game, you move up those tracks from 0 to 10. As you move up those tracks, they also give you power. But to reach the top spot and lock it out, you need to build a town. To build a town, you...
Found a town.
Found a town. To found a town, you need a total of 7 pips, depending on tier. So tier 1 is worth 1, tier 2 is worth 2, tier 3 is worth 3. You need a total of 7 pips and 4 linked buildings. You can then found a town, which nets you a whole bunch of victory points and usually another bonus along with it. And it also allows you to lock out a cult track if you get that far. And you get at the end of the game, you get first, second, and third placing on the cult tracks for each individual one. So if you win all of them, that's a massive whack of victory points at the end of the game. And finally, there's a conversion rate for money. So at the end of the game, you total up for every 3 coins you have, you get another victory point. Anything else you'd like to add about the rules?
Yeah, so when you place your tier 2 and tier 3 buildings, you get to unlock let's call it a bonus.
They're called favour tiles.
Favour tiles, yeah. And those are quite powerful. They usually tick over every turn, and it means that you can, for example, move power from one pot to another, or it might be that you gain income each turn, or it allows you to found towns for smaller
numbers of buildings.
Smaller numbers of buildings or pips.
Yeah.
So they are quite powerful and worth collecting.
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning that each faction plays differently. Each faction has got 2 powers. One that they have innately from the start of the game. So, for example...
Hobbits and burrowing.
Yeah. Dwarves can build structures underneath water, and they count as sort of linked, whereas most other races have to build bridges if they want to link their structures into one. Then they get a second power once they build their stronghold. So you've got 2 tier 3 buildings. You've got a stronghold and you've got a sanctuary, I think it's called, which is like the religious one. When you build your stronghold, you unlock a second power, as well as a good load of power income every turn. The game's played over 6 turns.
Yep.
Each turn, you also have a set of randomised tiles that will give you a victory point award for something you do during the turn. So, for instance, your tile may say for every structure, every settlement you build, you get 2 victory points. And on the right-hand side of each tile, we'll have a conversion rate of where you got to in a particular cult track that will give you an award depending on what the tile says. So, for instance, for every 4 you've got in the Earth cult track, you will get a spade to use at the end of the turn.
To terraform a plot.
Which is very, very key in general in the game, because making your plays to coincide with when you're going to get the most victory points, depending on how your tiles are panned out, is one of the main cruxes of it, really. And it's that thinking several turns ahead. Each round, I should have mentioned, it goes back and forth between the players taking actions. You can take one action per turn, then you go back and forth. There are no limits to the number of turns you can have. But the first player to pass, i.e. end their turn...
Because they've run out of resources, essentially.
Or just decide to, gets to pick the bonus tile first at the start of the next round.
And they get to go first.
So that knowing when to pass and planning your passes, again, is a key part of it. I think that's probably enough rules. It is a heavy game. Probably one of the heavier ones in our collection. It is very daunting when you first pull it out, because there's an awful amount of iconography and 350 different wooden tokens and chips and what have you. It's one of those games that can seem very, very intimidating when you first delve into it. But once you start to get your head around the iconography, it all kind of fits into place.
What I would say is that because you've only got 6 turns, and once you've actually learnt how to play, games are actually fairly short. So I would say, maybe an hour at most.
Yeah, I'd say an hour to an hour and a half, but that is with 2 people.
That's
Obviously,
with 2 people,
when you're playing with 3 or 4, I would book out, especially for initial games, I'd book out a good 3-hour slot to play this, because that actually could go on quite a while. And it is also a very thinky game, so your mileage might vary depending on how much people like to consider things.
Yes. If you're playing with me, for example.
Yeah, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, you play with me who just does stuff. So yeah, I think, the mileage will vary in terms of how long it takes, but I think most of our games tend to run about an hour and a bit-ish at this point. Yep. But we have played it a lot. Yeah.
So Al has a number of weird rules in life. One of those,
I like rules.
You do like rules. And one of those weird rules is around the number of times we try things out. So, for example, for TV, we have to watch 3 episodes of something before we sack it off. And with board games, the magic number 7, it's the magic 6.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Magic number 6. And I have to say, this game is a perfect example of why actually you're right.
I'm right 3 times a year on average.
Yes, that's your one time this year. I think when I first started playing this, even for me, who I like to think I'm a bit of a seasoned board gamer, I kind of know my way around a board game. I know my way around a meeple. But it definitely took 5 games before it really began to click. And by my 6th game, I was kind of away.
Yeah.
So I think there is like a real testament to when you pick up games that you really do try and give them a good play test. And I think why we are so adamant that we always review things, or we always play things at least 6 or 7 times before we'll review things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, and I think your first few games you're just sort of concentrating on one little part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely ignored the cult track. I was like, don't know what that is. I'm ignoring that for now. And then you whooped my ass. And so I think, it definitely not for newbies, definitely not for beginners.
No.
And it definitely takes a little bit of work.
Yeah.
In the early stages.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit more in one of the categories, but it's a game with a very high or potentially limitless skill ceiling.
Yeah.
It is a skill-based game. It's based on perfect information. Nothing is random. Well, aside from your starting stuff, so your bonus tiles and your turn victory conditions, nothing is randomised, and everything is visible. You know exactly how many victory points your opponent has.
You know exactly what your opponent's got as well in terms of resources and how much they're going to get. Yeah.
And as is the case with games like that with perfect information, a good player will beat somebody who's new every time, or at least they should, or they're not playing very well. And it is one of those things that it's really good to come up learning together, because if somebody has played a fair bit of it, it's going to be a very uphill climb for the other person.
Just so it seems to happen that of all the games that we own, this is your jam.
Yeah, this one works. I got my head around
your weird
this
lizard
one.
Brain?
Yeah, my weird lizard brain got its head around this one a lot quicker than most other games. If you have heard our other episodes, there's a bit of a running joke, but Hannah does tend to win most of our board games. I'm not very good at board games, despite hosting a podcast today.
Maybe because you don't think about them very much.
No, I don't think I do. I told you. But this one, for some reason, just clicked all the right places in my brain, so I'm feeling confident I'm quite good at this one.
Yeah. And boy, is it satisfying to beat you.
Yes, which is great. And that's the whole thing. That's the joy of games like this, because you know it is actually satisfying to win and beat the other person. Just a quick note on expansions. There are 2 expansions for this that I'm aware of. We have and play with Fire and Ice, but we're quite new to it. It was quite a recent acquisition. We're quite new to playing with that. I know there's a larger one called Seafarers that adds a few extra.
More mermaids.
I don't think there's more mermaids, but who knows? I don't know. I know there is another one.
Well, I know.
But I can attest that Fire and Ice is very good. It adds an extra 6 factions, a new map, and a bunch of other little cool things like a randomizer bag and a way to do. Because again, it's quite well balanced, but there are factions that are better than the others, and you have sort of an auction mechanic if you're playing with loads of people, which you can auction off victory points to choose your factions first and all that kind of stuff. We, as ever, tend to play with random factions. There is a sequel to it called Age of Innovation, which is, as far as I understand it, a more complex version, if you need that in your life. And there's also sort of a side rejig of it called Gaia Project, which is more highly rated in the Board Game Geek Top 100, which looks very appealing, but we haven't played yet. Sort of sci-fi instead of fantasy, really, but with a modular board instead of a set one.
Robot mermaids.
We can only hope.
So on that note, shall we move on to scoring?
Yes, let's move on to scoring.
So our first scoring category under the general theme is components. So we're talking about board space setup, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There are lots of fiddly little pieces.
Yes, there's a lot of...
Wooden cubes, wooden cylinders, stuff. Wooden buildings, wooden bridges, wooden counters. Yeah.
Although... good marks straight out the gate. This is one of the first games I had that came with sufficient numbers of baggies for everything.
Actually,
in the box.
Surplus
baggies.
Surplus baggies.
Really good, so they know how
you're wired.
What a mess it would be if you didn't sort it. I mean, the first word that comes to mind with it is functional.
Yeah, do you know, there's nothing fancy about it. Stripped down is kind of what I said. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got your different shapes of wooden cubes.
You have meeples, the wizards. They're not called wizards.
No, they're called priests. I insist on calling them wizards. Yeah, you've got your classic meeples. You've got various different shapes of wooden buildings. You know, very, very Catan-esque.
Yeah.
Your bridges are pretty much roads from Catan. You know, all that. It's all that classic look and feel that you'd expect from a Euro board game. And there is a lot, but obviously you have different colours for all of the different... Well, each of the different factions is a two-sided player board. And they share a colour, but there's a lot of different colours to go around, as it were.
Yeah. There's nothing fancy about it. It does what it says on the tin. The artwork on the actual faction sort of image portrait, that's quite cool.
Yeah.
But there's not a huge amount of it.
Yeah, you just got one picture for each faction, basically. But yeah, it's very clean and very precise and very
That's what it says on its tin.
But nothing to write home about.
No, and I would say that setup, because the amount of small little fiddly pieces does take a while. Yeah. And their round cylinders are always falling on the floor, so you're hunting around on the floor trying to find that one little...
Do you have a habit of just escaping? Yeah. And I think out of all the games that we have, this is the propensity to have accidental lost pieces, big time, because there's so many little wooden pips and chits and, you know, all the rest of it. It's always a bit of a worry. You've got to be very careful you get everything back in. And yeah, setup does take a while. Teardown's a lot quicker.
Yeah.
But setting up does take a little bit. But again, if you're doing it as a pair and you both have your sort of roles and doing the setup, you can get through in about 10 minutes.
So I scored it a 6. It is good. It does what it needs to, but nothing special.
I scored it a 7. I think I bumped it up one for the surplus baggies. That
Oh my god! Okay, all right, yeah, fine.
No, I think I'd say about a 7. I think it's functional. There's nothing to write home about, but there's no negatives either. Yeah. Really.
So then on to complexity. So complexity includes things like AP, so analysis paralysis, also arguing about the rules. But as we always say, it's not necessarily about how complex a game is, but how well that complexity serves the game.
Yeah.
So this is a heavy Euro. It is designed to be complicated, and it is designed to tax your brains. What I would say is the iconography on it is really alienating. And I think that's probably why it took so long for me to get my head around it. Each of your factions have obviously their own separate skill set or rules or whatever. Even now, I still have to ask you to translate it for me. I'm like, what does this mean? What does this do?
Yeah, particularly on the faction boards. I think a lot of the time, even now, I mean, I haven't got them all memorised. I have to look at the rule book and see what it means. You can't tell what it means just from the iconography. Sometimes I can, but sometimes you can't. But it is a case of almost learning a bit of a hieroglyphic language. And again, once it falls into place, you're all right. But this is definitely the most intimidating version of that I've seen so far. Like, there's a lot to sort of wrap your head around in terms of what everything means. And yes, I take your point that their character boards, the skills of the character boards could perhaps be a little bit more clear, without having to refer to the rulebook every time and say, oh, what does that mean?
Yeah. However, there is no actual writing. So aside from explaining the rules, which I mean in itself is going to be quite burdensome, it does cross a language barrier.
Yeah, it's completely language independent once you've got the rules all the way, because everything is iconography. So that has advantages as well. in terms of how complex the game actually is and how well it serves the gameplay, I think is one of its main plus points. Because, as I said earlier, it does have an incredibly high skill ceiling. It is a complex game, but it's not so complex that you're constantly referring to the rulebook once you get going. The only time we ever look at the rulebook now is just to check the faction stuff. What does this faction do? I think the concepts in isolation are fairly easy to wrap your head around. It's the combination of everything and how everything interplays together. Mm-hmm. And I think once you get your head around it, a lot of the complexity, as it were, comes with the actual gameplay. Mm-hmm. So the complexity is trying to figure out the puzzle that particular knight's board and set of tiles has presented you with, mm-hmm. and how your faction best interacts with that puzzle. It's very much a game of sort of maximization. You try and squeeze every last drop out of your resources in your turn, because if you don't, you can quickly get left behind. And
without sabotaging yourself for future turns.
Yeah, without sabotaging yourself for future turns, so going too hard too early, and therefore then ending up, kind of lost the next turn.
Financially and morally bankrupt.
Yes, exactly. What, morally? What are you doing?
Mermaids?
What are you doing? Let's not go into that.
I'm going to challenge you a little bit there, because the whole cult track thing. So, obviously I always said, the first couple of games I kind of ignored it because I didn't really know what it was or how it works. I don't necessarily feel it's particularly integrated particularly well with the rest of the game, and it feels like another way to get victory points. I'm not sure that I just feels like almost a bit tacked on for me.
I would disagree. The reason I would disagree is it's one of the main mechanics that you use your priests for.
Well, no, you use your priests also to level up your other things.
Yes, you can. That's one thing you can do with them. Yeah. But again, it's about choices. You can choose to neglect it, but if you neglect it at your peril.
Yeah, yes. But I mean, you can say that for any game, any sort of scoring criteria. Again, I feel like it's another thing to worry about or to focus your efforts on that is almost ancillary to the main point of building hamlets and building towns. And therefore, we talk about complexity and how well it serves the game. I just feel it's a little bit tacked on. Okay,
fair enough. I strongly disagree. I think it's a vital component of it. I think it adds an additional dimension to it. I think it would be, if you took that away entirely and just concentrated on the building the buildings, it would still work as a game, but I don't think it would be nearly as deep.
Okay. I mean, maybe.
I agree to it. It's fine.
Maybe I'm just still salty about having forgotten about it for those first times. I wish I could continue to forget about it.
But if that's how you feel, that's fine.
Thanks.
So yeah, I mean, this for me is one of the best marriages of complexity and gameplay I know of. I absolutely adore the rule set. Once I had got my head around it, eventually, I love how complex it is. I love how many different layers there are. I love how many different choices and options you have constantly on how you do things. And I love the fact that you're presented with a different puzzle every time. You're presented with something quite. No two games seem to play the same. And I don't think that would be possible without the depth of the rule set underpinning it.
Okay. How did you score it then?
I gave it a 9.
Okay, so I gave it a 7.
Okay.
I think that, it's mainly the iconography that definitely put me off to begin with, and I think I'm scoring it down for that. Mm-hmm. The cult tracks I've mentioned. And I'm also not entirely convinced that, and perhaps it's more of a two-player issue, that there is... Whilst we've had some real nail-biting games and how we've got to those victory points and those end points are different, I'm not really sure that I necessarily see it quite the same as you do.
Okay. Shall we move on to shelf life?
Yeah.
And value for money.
So one of the things I think that is great about this is that it is very complicated, and most of our very complicated games stretch on for hours and hours and hours. And actually, this doesn't for us.
No.
So if we want to stretch our brains and have a bit of a thinky one, but we've still only got limited time, this really, really fits the bill. And I think because of that, it's a really fantastic game, and it's going to sit on our shelf for a really long time.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I don't ever see myself getting bored of this. I don't think there's ever been an occasion where it's been suggested I haven't wanted to play it. Mm-hmm. I have just as much fun, God knows how many games we are in now that I did when I was just starting to get my head around the rules. Like, I have a good time playing it every single time I play it.
And there are enough factions, I think, that allow you for variability. So I think you've played all of the factions at least once, except for some of the newer ones.
Yeah, I think so.
I have not, because I think I'm more of a learning curve for me. Mm-hmm. So I like to play with my... Actually, I only played Mermaids once, and they didn't do very well. You know, they're my nemesis. I will play them again and I will win.
No, but you define a couple of factions that you kind of stick to.
Yeah, and I think that's because that's in my realm of comfort and my comfort zone, so I kind of stick to them. But even then, I think, you know, you do have playoffs between the two different factions.
Yeah.
I suppose, and again, this is going sort of towards our 2-player rating, it's about how much you get that interplay when you play as two.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot that I'll say.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that later, but I think, you know, there is a huge amount of shelf life there.
I mean, I can see myself playing this in 10 years.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I'll ever get... I mean, I am very, very curious about the sequel and the Gaia project.
Yeah, I'd like to play that.
Maybe when we get them, it might kill this. And, you know, I think the answers is where that happened. I'm glad we went in at this level and not the later ones. But, you know, that would be the only scenario I could see myself moving this along. Otherwise, it'll always be part of the collection, I think.
Mm-hmm. How much does it retail for?
I think it's about 60.
Of course, that's pricey. I think
it's. I'd say it's about average for a box that size with that number of components these days. I think that's about fair.
All right.
You'd be hard pressed to find something with that amount of stuff in it for less than that.
Yeah. Well,
again, it's also production materials like they are wood, so you know that does drive the cost up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a classic, and it can operate on that name, so you won't see it half price anywhere, kind of thing. You know, it's very rare. But I gave it a 10 because I just don't see myself getting bored of it.
So 8 for me.
Yeah.
Again, I think you're absolutely right. We will probably still be playing this in 10 years' time, and it's a frequent one in our rotation that I don't think is going to wear out anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, the depth is so massive that, you know, you dive into it and you feel even close to touching bottom. Like every time the depth just seems to get deeper every time we play. So there's that to it as well, which is the constant pull. Okay.
So is it any fun? Go on, wax lyrical about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really have, to be fair. I think I've touched on most of the points why I find it so fun. It is an immensely satisfying game to play. It tickles something in my brain that just... I mean, I can say the same for a lot of good Euros, but there's something about it that just, when things work, when you have a plan, you execute it, it comes off so satisfyingly. When you actually find that turn where you've timed things right and you're getting loads of victory points because you're putting the right things down because that's what the victory point card wants. You're planning out your resources and you're getting all your sums right and everything just plays off as it should. You get chain reactions going. It's super satisfying. It's really, really satisfying. And because of all that, and because of its complexity, and because there's no hidden information, nothing can pull the rug out from under you. You win or lose depending on how well you play. And it makes losing easier, but also makes winning more satisfying, for me anyway. Because if you lose, you go, I messed up, my opponent didn't. And you know that. And if you win, you're like, I played better. Yeah.
So yes, I agree with that. It is a very satisfying game to play. I don't know that it scratches the itch in the same way for me as it does for you.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that quite often, because resources are so tight, you are counting things down to the very last penny, maximising everything you possibly can do, which often causes a lot of analysis paralysis for me because I have to plan out each turn. Don't really get that so hard with this.
No, you don't, which is all surprised me. I thought this would be really bad.
Yeah, I think maybe it's because in the early games I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, so I was just like, wah, you know.
Play like me.
But playing a bit more like you. So perhaps maybe I don't have it so bad, but I do feel like particularly early on in the game when you make mistakes, it punishes you really hard, and then it's really difficult to catch up, and you're kicking yourself about that stupid thing you did in turn one and how you misspent your wizard, warlock, priest. Yeah, whatever, your meeple. And that happens to me quite a lot. I think maybe because I don't necessarily see the puzzle that you do. But I do think far enough ahead. It's just can't quite get there.
Yeah, I don't mean you don't think far. You always think more so than me, but I don't think that puzzle adds up in your brain the same way it does for me.
Yeah.
So I see almost like a thread, like a through line to get from here to here to here. And I don't think your brain necessarily works like that.
Yeah. And so then I do feel like I'm kicking myself, and that's maybe the bit where I have less fun.
Yeah.
Maybe I should be more forgiving of myself.
Yeah, you are very hard on yourself. You're very frustrated when you haven't done something optimally.
Yeah.
And again, but that's different personality types, isn't it? So again, if people are like that, you get frustrated with yourself. But I think the point I'm making, that one of the reasons I love it so much, but might be problematic for other people, is if you mess up, it is you that has messed up. You can't blame the game.
Yeah.
You know, and if that causes you to get frustrated, buyer beware. You know. The only things I would say, the two slight knocks on it, is depending on your faction and the state of what the board is presented to you, the first couple of turns can feel very slight.
Yeah, you don't feel like you're getting anywhere, you don't feel like you're doing very much, you feel like you're constantly battling and fighting for resources.
Yeah, or just treading water. When really you need to see it as laying the foundations and prioritising, well, actually, is it that I need money, therefore I need to put down trading houses, or is it that I need workers, in which case I need to put down settlements, for example? Yeah, for example. One thing I have noticed is the more we play, the better we get at it, the longer our earlier turns are getting. I have noticed that there has been a creep up in terms of how much we're getting out of those early turns. So again, I think there is a little bit of like a sort of skill thing there where you learn to maximise those early turns and also what you should be concentrating on in those early turns. But you can get combinations of factions of bonus cards and victory conditions that can make those turns feel very, very slight.
Yeah.
And again, that just depends. It completely depends on the game.
But you're both in the same situation.
Yeah, you can be in the same boat, really. The other thing with it to be aware of is it has got a little bit of a runaway leader problem, where you can get in a situation where you like turn 4 out of 6 and the writing's absolutely on the wall and really obviously on the wall.
Well, you say that,
there have been instances where one of us caught up.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of games recently where you've been storming into the lead, but I've pipped you at the post, or almost come close to pipping you at the post.
Yeah, probably because I thought I was so far in the lead, I got a bit complacent as well. And go like, I'll just coast here. Then you've actually had a plan and I haven't. So there's all things like that, but I do think potentially it can have a bit of a runaway leader problem, particularly if there's a slight skill gap.
Yeah.
And that could be quite disheartening for another player or group of players.
And don't forget that, as I said at the start, you start on 20 victory points, and that's because you can trade victory points for power. So actually, by turn 3, you could actually be behind where you originally started.
Yeah, but with an immense amount of power in the bank.
I mean, unlikely, but
unlikely,
it's plausible, and that doesn't feel good.
No, it does not. But for me, those are very, very minor quibbles.
So how did you rate it?
9.
So I gave it a 7.
Yeah. Not one of my favourite games, so I'm very comfortable giving it a 9 for fun. I have a blast every time we play.
Okay, so let's total those scores up.
So that gives us a grand average total of 7.8, so we round, so that's an 8 for Terra Mystica, which I think is befitting its classic status.
Okay, so now for our 2-player specific categories, and the first of them is Table Talk.
Yes. I mean, the short answer to this is not a huge amount.
No.
It's an odd one because there's not an awful lot of sort of direct interaction over the table with each other when you're playing it. There is interaction when you bump up against each other on the map, and there's an awful lot of using powers before the other person, which I didn't mention in the rules part, but a lot of the power-based actions you can take. Once you use that's it for the round. You get a little X over it, and you can't use it again. So there's an element of you like sort of getting in before other people. But in terms of actual sort of interaction verbally, not a huge amount.
No, and I mean you can kind of explain what you're doing for your turns, but aside from that, it's kind of it really. And I think to a certain extent you do keep things close to your chest because you don't particularly want to like spread what your strategy is or what you're aiming for.
Yeah.
So no, there isn't a huge amount of interaction.
It's one of those quiet and thinky games, really.
Yeah.
What I will say in its favour is the format of taking an action and then going to the other person and back and forth means you're not. this is a game where somebody might have to sit there for quite a long time in silence. Well, if somebody played out, if you had all their actions, for example, but that back and forth is quite snappy and it keeps everyone engaged. So there's not sort of like loads of downtime in between.
However, if you have multiple players, if you have more than 2 players, I think, again, turns would get quite long and your board state can change quite a lot.
Yeah.
So you probably do then need more thinking time because actually you kind of know at the start of your turn what it is that you're aiming to achieve by the end of that turn.
Yeah, fair enough. And that could very well be the case, yeah. But again, you with everything being out there, people aren't doing things in secret, so you've got to keep a close eye on what people are doing so you understand the way the board is changing and what actions they're taking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I gave this a 5. I don't think it's a massive markdown to it, but it's not the most interactive of games.
Yeah, so I gave it a 6.
Okay.
Again, because I think we do still talk and we do still chit chat and stuff happens, but yeah, it's not the most interactive of
games.
No. So then we have competitiveness / co-op.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely competitiveness in this part.
Well, yes, and I would say that when we play it as 2, actually we don't bump up against each other a huge amount, and quite a lot of the time I feel like I am in some ways playing very much solo and looking at my own resource management and my own resource management and what can I maximise on my turn. It's about playing with my current board state, where I am, and what's the best that I can achieve with the hand that I've been dealt, with the aim of getting more victory points than you.
Yeah.
So, yes, there is, obviously, it's fiercely competitive, and towards the end, like, absolutely. But for a lot of the game, it often feels a bit like solo and you're there.
That's strange. It never feels like that to me, because I think it very much... There's an element of reactivity to it that is not there in some of the play solo together type thing, like thinking back to something like Mystic Vale, which is very much feels like a solo game you play together. I don't get that feeling in this at all.
I think it's different when we play games where we've got our factions next to each other. So we're competing for tile space to terraform those tiles, or where we are getting bonuses because we're building buildings against other people's buildings and we get like victory point trade-off. But for the last game, for example, we had to play at opposite ends of the map because of various victory conditions in the expansion, which we won't get into. But actually it meant we played an entirely solo game where we never even touched each other.
Yeah, you say that, but then there's other things going alongside the map. There is the
cult track, yes.
The cult tracks. There is the power-based actions.
Power-based actions don't really come into it until later game, and I would also say to a certain extent neither do the cult tracks, because you need your wizards to use them, not wizards. Priests.
Yeah, there's also the bonus tiles. There's an element of racing to it all the time that I get from it.
Yeah, but I don't get that I'm racing against you. I feel like I'm racing against...
times that you've scuppered, maybe it's because I've done it less to you, but you've scuppered my plans so many times by grabbing things.
Oh yeah, but that's because I can see what you're going to do. Yes, yeah. And so yes, there is that competitiveness, but that's not... That's... it's not the thing that I feel most. I feel like I'm almost competing with myself.
Fair enough. Okay, that's fine. No, I get a huge competitive vibe from it. I do find it a very competitive game. I do find it, at least in the gameplay space, quite interactive. There's the element of, building next to each other, but I think it very much depends on your game plan and your faction, because there's been times where you put down like, oh, I'm coming right next to you because I need that to execute what it is that I'm going to do. I think that's a lot more challenging in two-player games because it's so wide open. I think it's unavoidable in more denser multiplayer games. But I think if you want to lean into it, you can. And there have been times that I have, because that fit my faction and fit what I was trying to achieve. And I think the race up the cult tracks can get very, very competitive. I think that is particularly late game. If you're both relatively on an even keel, that can get very, very back and forth. And you just trying to squeeze the most out of your resources to make sure you beat the other person on that track.
Yeah.
And that, by its very nature, to me, is competitive.
Yeah.
And maybe it's that abstractness of there's no conflict, but there is competitiveness.
Yeah, no, see, it's not about the conflict for me. It's not even about that because, again, for me, racing up the cult track is about the resources that I have. And yes, it would be better to place it here because it means that I get more power and I get above you. And yes, ultimately, I want to be above you in all of them if I can. But it's more about resource management and where am I going to get most return on my investment.
Yeah. I don't know what to approach about it because, again, it depends what you're doing. Because if you're neglecting them, then I can then funnel things into something else. So again, it's that reactivity. What have you done? Do I need to pivot what I'm doing to keep up with you?
This is really weird.
Yeah, but probably the biggest disconnect.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the time I am looking at what you're doing and I'm pivoting and changing what I might tack depending on what you've done or what I think you're going to do.
And maybe that's because, again, it clicked for you a lot earlier on and I'm still perhaps behind you in the learning because...
Maybe that's something that will suddenly kick in.
Yeah, we talked about one of our earlier games that I don't necessarily lean into particularly what my faction does, and I sometimes find that quite difficult to do.
And you got a lot better when you did start paying a bit more attention to
and
that.
so maybe it's something that will click at a later time point for me, but yeah, I don't know that I feel that competitiveness in the same way that you do.
I find the only...
And yeah, I think I would do if we had more players, which we'll come on to in a minute.
We'll come on to that in a second. I think with the exception of June and our two-player only duel type games, I find this the most competitive one in our collection.
I would have to sit and think and look.
I feel like I'm most in control, and I feel like it's the most head-to-head, aside from June Imperium. June Imperium is on a slightly different level, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, food for thought. Anyway, so how did you rate it?
8.
So I gave it a 6.
Okay, fine.
All right,
so
and then
comes the big one.
Scalability. So this is FOMO. Does it need more players?
Yeah,
it
does need more players. Yes, it does. I mean, we're wading into a massive discourse around this anyway, and I think it's a...
All of the things that you've talked about would all be massively increased and massively better if you have more people on the map taking up more space and more fighting over resources.
Yes.
You know, you talked about, when you mess up, that's on me because that was my decision to make. But actually with more players, there'll be more players sabotaging what it is that you're about to do. And I think that's where the real fun and the joy... And maybe it's because I can see that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can as well.
That maybe I then feel that it perhaps lacks.
Yeah, the game does nothing to force you to butt heads. You have to choose to do that, and in a 2-player game, it is less reliable that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
You can end up in scenarios as that game you mentioned where we were on the opposite end of the map, kind of doing our own thing for want of a better term.
Because also the map itself, you know, you obviously pick where you start, and it makes sense to pick places where there are lots of your land option available.
Or things that you can easily
terraform without too much cost, because terraforming early game is really expensive.
Yeah, it's crippling. If you go in the wrong direction, it can completely wipe out your resources.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the maps, so a lot of the places that you start, you know, you are going to start in very different places, which means that often money is a real issue for us and a real struggle for us, because you have to pay through the nose for your trading houses.
Yeah, because you're not adjacent to another.
Because you're not adjacent to another player. And that then becomes really costly. So actually, you know, money is the thing that we really struggle for.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this doesn't cry out for more people.
Yeah.
Okay? I think that is a given. I think everybody understands that. I think this was always designed with, I would say, at least 4 people in mind.
Although it would make it an exceedingly long game.
Yes, it would be a long, but any heavy game you play with 4 people is going to take you. You know, you need to book out an entire evening or afternoon for that. So yes.
When you're old like us and go to bed at 9:30, yeah.
So, I mean, absolutely, 0 arguments from me on that case, on that front. It is a game that desperately wants more people. It's designed for that. It should be played as that.
Is it broken?
No. It is absolutely not, and this is what I wanted to get absolutely clear, and this is why I disagree with some of the discourse that I've seen. There seems to be quite a lot of people out there who categorically say this is pretty much unplayable with 2. I'm sure you can judge. We've only ever played as a 2-player game. I'm sure you can judge from my scores in the first half of this episode. I think that's categorically untrue.
It may be better.
It may be better with more. I mean, I have a feeling if I did have a regular 4-player group playing this, I don't know if I'd play anything else. It's that good.
Nemesis.
Or Nemesis. But I wouldn't let that put you off at least giving this a go at 2.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it makes it a different game, but it does not make it a bad one. I think that's my point here. I think because it makes it a bit of a different game, I think people write it off. And I imagine if you've got used to playing it in a group and you try to play it as 2, you'd be like, oh, this is it's too different. It's a different beast.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make it less of a fun, engaging, exciting board game.
So what I would say is that for people, because it's a very strategic game, and you've talked about the fact that it is a skill game, that when you then have other people thwarting it, it makes it so much more nail biting, and you would have to be really on the fly and really reactive, and that is not what happens when you play it at 2.
No.
You can almost plan out how you're going to, well, I'm sure you probably do, kind of plan out how you're going to get to victory and what it is that you need to achieve, and it becomes almost how well can I execute my plan versus that cutthroatness. And I think, yeah, maybe that's why I like it less, I guess.
Potentially. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think one thing to be aware of, though, is, as I've said, this is very much a skill ceiling kind of game.
Are you about to tell me it's a learn to play issue on my part? No, I'm joking.
No, not at all.
First time ever.
No, that's not about you. If you did get a group of 4 or 5 people, say, round the table to play this, the likelihood they're all at the same level is going to be quite low.
Yeah.
And if you're playing a 3-hour game, and say, for example, let's just take us as an example, who, we played this over 20 times. We got one of our friends round and go, let's play Terra Mystica. It would be an horrific beatdown for 2 hours.
And they'd also walk off and get bored.
Yeah, they would have a really bad time. So I think there is an element of skill matching to it, where it's all very well to say, oh, okay, 4 people would be a great game. Not necessarily. You could have 2 people who are just runaway leaders and 2 people who are just having a really bad time, depending on how they approach board games. But I could see that. I think you'd have to be quite careful to kind of skill match within the groups that you're playing with, if you had the luxury of choosing. Because I do think people who played it a fair amount will just run away with it, and that might put other people off. I don't know, depending on the kind of person they are. So yeah, I mean, I had a real sort of head-heart conversation with myself here. Head says this should be somewhere down a 3. Heart says it's a 5 for me, because I think it is absolutely playable and it's not broken at 2.
Yeah, so I went with 5 because of the fact that it's not broken at 2. It would absolutely be better with more, but it's not broken. It's perfectly playable and it's a good game at 2. It's just not
the game is.
It could be.
Yeah, it's meant to be. It was designed to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think for me 5 is fair. I could mark it further down, but I just want to make a point that sometimes trying these things out at 2, just because there's a prevailing discourse that it doesn't work, isn't always true.
Okay. So let's total those scores up.
So that gives us a average total of 5.8, so a 2-player rating of 6, which is probably a point too high.
Probably, yeah.
I think my feelings about its competitiveness has bumped that up probably a point above where it should be. Yeah. But scoring system is a scoring system, so we say 6, but reality is 5. So, yeah, one of my favourite games. Not the best 2-player game.
But give it a whirl. If you're there at your local board game cafe, or you rent board games, or, board game club or whatever, give it a crack.
Yeah, I think it's very much in the, if you play it as 2, maybe a try before you buy scenario. I absolutely love it. We've got so many hours of fun out of it. I do disagree with that should only be for 3+, but there are issues. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. As always, if you've listened to us on your podcast medium of choice, a review or a star rating or whatever it allows you to do will be very much welcomed.
If you're watching on YouTube, then like and subscribe.
Yeah, we've just gone live on YouTube a little while ago. Probably 2 months ago by the time this actually goes out. We'll look behind the curtain there. But until next time, have fun, be good to each other, and play lots of board games.